When we think about change in marketing, or in fact in any industry, in any role, I don't know if this is something you've thought about, but there can be a mindset that says, change is something I have to endure for a little while and then it'll go away. I'll go back to normal. What if it doesn't? Hello, Mark Jones here. Thanks for joining us on the CMO Show. I am your host, and this show is brought to you by Impact Institute in partnership with Adobe. Today we've got a really interesting conversation about change, but not change for its own sake, or in fact change just because you've got to deal with it as it comes and goes. But in the world of marketing, and in particular we want to look at financial services, change has become, if you like, an ever-present issue that financial services organisations have to deal with. And even if you're not in this sector, it's interesting and instructive to learn from how we can have an always-on adaptive mindset, if I can coin the phrase. We've got to be constantly in touch with our customers. We've got to know how they're thinking and feeling and what's the experience they have on a day-to-day level. In fact, at a very, very granular, highly detailed level. This is one of the biggest challenges we have in marketing. So I'm really excited for our conversation today. Chris Young is the Senior Director for Global Industry Strategy at Adobe here in Australia from the US, and brings a really interesting global perspective across all of financial services. Let's hear what he's got to say. Chris Young, Senior Director of Global Industry Strategy at Adobe. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Tell me about your role. What does it entail? The global bit I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah, so as Senior Director, Head of Global Industry Strategy, my team focuses on taking what is considered a horizontal set of applications and then translating them into meaningful use cases for various industries. My background is financial services. The folks on my team cover various industries like retail and health and life sciences and manufacturing. The global part is, this is a global company, and there's a lot of what can be learned between different regions. And what you saw, I flew in today to meet with Australian financial services companies, and I've done that in Sao Paulo, Mexico City. We have a really strong global community of customers. And a huge part of how we advance the industry overall is sharing these best practices. So it's a huge focus of us to look at those best practices between regions and then share them to move these industries collectively forward.
I'm sure you've seen this idea that it's not just one financial services industry, but many, when you look at from a global point of view, because while there's a collective understanding, you've got differences in countries and in regions as the way they treat money, regulations are different, and on it goes.
I had to learn what a superannuation firm was.
There you go.
Before joining here. But yeah,
instead of 401k, of course.
It's very, very similar. But yeah, we focus, at least in financial services, on various sub-industries. There's the insurance, but there's life insurance and property and casualty. A lot of these life insurance companies operate more like a wealth management firm. We work with some of the largest asset management companies in the world, and of course, banks. And what we found is, look, there's a lot of similarities, but there are very significant differences. A lot of the business models are different, B2B, B2B2C. And in all of those cases, you have various permutations of how our applications work to engage either an individual investor or an advisor or an institution. And all of those distinctions are really important to make and for our customers to understand how to best utilize our applications.
If you just go back, say, the last couple of months, tell me about some of the pain points you've been hearing from customers. What's going on at the moment?
Well, I think that generally speaking, our customers have been and will continue to be under pressure, especially the marketers. The classic do more with less, but I think the stakes are getting higher. The uncertainty is adding to that. And look, there's been a lot of investment in MarTech over the years, and the CFO is now knocking on the door saying, like, okay, show me the money. But the types of things that our customers are looking to solve for are far more significant in terms of top-line revenue growth, expanding product portfolios, adding thousands of customers, while simultaneously looking to reduce the cost of operations, to increase efficiency. I mean, these are far different conversations than we've been having with customers when I first joined Adobe 12 years ago. A lot of it was, how quickly can I produce this piece of content, or increase engagement, or increase click-through rates? I think it shows, the maturity of the industry, but also the maturity of our applications in delivering more of these more significant business outcomes.
Something I've thought a little bit about in this sector is the concept of value, because as you drive the cost of transactions down, for example, we need to tell a different story about the value an institution might have to a customer. So it's this idea of, why am I with this bank anymore? Like, what do they do for me? That's a different conversation to rates, maybe a security story. The value conversation is an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think we were talking today, we do a survey every year, the Digital Trends Report, and I get 5 specific questions I get to ask to financial services responders in particular. One is like, what is the main primary objective that you're trying to achieve? And you get the usual cast of characters of things like, deflection from traditional channels to reduce costs, so like less calls to the call center or branch visits, selling more to compete with digital entrants, modernizing experiences for younger generations. But one that always surfaces to the top, and a significant separation, is improving digital interactions to increase financial health and well-being. Right. And that's basically just helping people make smarter decisions with their money. Like, that's how you add value. Right. There's a lot of things about cross-selling and upselling and acquiring customers, but if you go back to that, the meaningful outcome to that individual, it could be service related, it could be transactional, like that's where you start building trust and loyalty. That's value to an individual or to a business.
I don't know if there are any standout examples of maybe banks or organizations that you've worked with where some of those things are, some really great examples?
I mean, the one that I refer back to is that we've got a lot of the banks in Spain, as an example, that are looking to get involved real time to a point of sale decline. So there's like these moments where, you're looking to purchase something that's, really significant or important, and you get that decline at point of sale, which causes all sorts of issues. And the real-time response is interesting. One is like, okay, we can extend you, depending on who you are, we can extend you more money or a small loan. Maybe it's just a question of just moving balances from one account to the other. It could be another, a credit extension, all of those other things. But the idea is having that take place in real time, in that moment, and kind of really dealing with that situation there. And I think that's the significance of it. That's the thing that a lot of our customers are looking to do, is being there in those moments that matter, real time, and giving, the right response to the customer. Mm.
Yeah, so we're seeing, not just with the existing systems, but of course with AI, we're seeing incredible levels of automation, and then this agentic world, and then I'm quite interested in the orchestration that's going on. So the sophistication of the systems that we have now to support the scenario you just spoke about is really gone through the roof. I've seen it, over the last 2 years in particular. I wonder what your sense is as you think about the trends here. Where is this headed?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're looking at there is what I would consider like more traditional predictive type AI versus generative, or even the AI assistants that we have. And then even further beyond that is agentic. And here's like the dirty little secret, which is, the financial services industry is still struggling to get these sorts of applications approved. So when I was here this morning, show of hands of how many are using these generative AI capabilities, not many in the room. And the reality is that there's nothing about these applications that ultimately get in the way of legal risk and compliance. It's just a question of education. But that said, we're seeing a lot of the industry, several companies in the United States, like making, and even in Southeast Asia as an example, making really significant strides when it comes to things like content. That's like low-hanging fruit in terms of concepting, generating net new images, scaling the production of them in mass. Like, the idea is like, how long does it typically take to create a campaign? This one company, as an example, 21 days. The average for a campaign was 21 days. They produced maybe 240 campaigns a year, 3,600 assets. Through the use of generative AI for content and scaled production, they went from 240 campaigns to 600. 3,600 assets to 8,000. 21 days went from 16 to 10 and now to 5. Like, that's the promise of it. It's not just the scale of content creation, but also the speed to market. Because if you think about like value and outcomes for the consumers, how do you do that, right? You have to increase the experimentation. That takes content. They increase the level of personalization. That takes content. Because a lot of times you might have, companies that are like, hey, I'd like to target these 10 segments. I can only produce them for 5. So these are unmet needs being met through lack of relevant content because of the gap in content production and scale.
It's an interesting time for marketers around the world because the demand to upskill is massive. And I don't think we actually talk about that enough in terms of
Absolutely.
just how much you need to understand now.
Yeah.
What's your take on how you're seeing marketers deal with this challenge?
I think the role of marketing has changed pretty fundamentally. And I use this example of, when I was in marketing, a lot of the times I would represent the brand to the consumer. This is why you do business with us. Now, the marketer represents the customer to the rest of the business. So they have a much bigger seat at the table when it comes to transformations. They're getting far more technical in what they need to do, but they're also now being more responsible for ROI and impact. So, to your point, the role of marketing is becoming more technical, more analytic in nature, not necessarily just the pure creativity and brand. But here's the interesting thing, all the gaps, we've done studies, all the gaps are the same. Like, I can't find the right number of individuals with the right skill sets. I have to train individuals. One of the big ones, by the way, is just alignment of KPIs and objectives. That's like the number one. If you don't solve that, none of these other things matter. But now we have to go back and thinking about the promise of what AI, agentic AI, even generative AI does. It simply reduces the complexity and threshold for someone to understand a highly technical set of applications and use them to the best of their ability. Because that's the other thing, right? You might have skill sets associated with some applications, but do they really know the full extent of the, text prompts and agentic help, right, is just a great equalizer for, more and more people to use these applications. You don't want 10 people using analytics, you want several thousand. And you extrapolate that across, all these different MarTech type applications. That's where the scale comes from.
And interestingly enough, the value is created at scale too, because now you have people getting answers to the actual business problem that they've got, not trying to, if you like, read the tea leaves of these apps and build something on the fly.
Here's another dirty little secret. The role of marketing today is pretty administrative. So if asking those questions, I have to ask someone a question like that. I've got an idea, I'm probably filling out a form for someone else to create that. So now you think about the direction of our applications, generative AI, AI assistants, agentic as well, that allows these individuals to operate far more independently. Within the guardrails that are set in the use of these tools, what data can be accessed, custom models in terms of how they create content that's on brand, that's the vision of it.
So tell me about data, privacy, security, ethics. That whole space is emerging rapidly. Again,
Yes.
You've got this unique global view where you start to pick some trends and start to see maybe how it's moving in different geographies. What's your take?
Well, I think, these types of regulations also vary by industry, but they're universal in a sense of, even a lot of the survey data that we get is there's a high expectation that the customers are giving data for very specific purposes, and they rely on these industries to use that data with a high degree of trust and security. So that's the obligation, that the industry has. And I think the way that we think about it is are we going to have every capability to every single rule? No. But the idea is governance and setting these standards. So our applications allow you to set these guardrails, set access to who has it, label data at point of ingestion, meaning this is what it is, this is where it can be used, this is where it can't be used. And I think as a foundational principle for what we do, I think that sort of flexibility and recognizing, you're in a privacy-first environment is significant.
When we think about the impact of tariffs on the financial services industry, the bottom line that I've observed is this sense of uncertainty that you touched on a little bit earlier. We've seen incredible market volatility in the past 100 days, if you want to maybe use that as one of the recent markers from a political point of view.
Yep.
What are you hearing, seeing, feeling in the customer base at Adobe when you start looking at the response or lack thereof, right? The sort of almost sitting it and waiting it out among the customer base with Adobe.
Let's look at this three ways. I think the first is, again, the team that I manage looks across different industries, and we did a whole recording internally. Retail, consumer goods, travel, what their reactions would be to these types of tariffs, and what are the downstream impacts. And financial services, I went last because we're one of the last dominoes to fall. Yeah. So obviously, immediate impact to things like retail, immediate impact to things like travel. But ultimately, if the consumer spending power goes down, you start getting into like loan defaults and late payments and all sorts of other downstream effects that they've seen. But that's the bad news. Yeah. Also the bad news is also these companies are risk averse, so they're not going to wait for these things to happen. They're going to project. You're also hearing things like provisions for loan losses. These things are already happening. But the good news is that this industry has seen this before, right? They've seen this before with the pandemic, and they understood the nature of digital and agility and being responsive, continuing to build trust and be there for these individuals in these moments. They saw how those investments that they've made over the past, before the pandemic, really paid off and then continued to accelerate them. So I believe they will see very similar patterns of what they need to do for their customers, and part of that is, again, the experience, the personalization, the development of trust, and the agility that's required to deliver it.
They say never waste a good crisis, and so there's lessons being learned, right? You mentioned COVID. We went through the crisis, we learned, and the companies that lent into that as an investment opportunity, generally speaking, were the ones that came out a little bit better off.
Totally agree.
What's your advice? I love advice for marketers who are looking in this sector, in financial services, trying to keep up, we've been talking about, and looking to make sure that they're able to push the organisations forward, not just sort of treading water. What's the best approach that you've seen from a global point of view?
I think you can get caught up quickly in a lot of these like edge case type capabilities, the flashy AI type things, and I think it's very difficult for this industry that's risk averse to really just allow this sort of experimentation. What I've seen is what I've seen really successful are just the arduous task of building the proper foundation. So I've worked with a company that is now one of our best, as an example. And when I first met with them, they were a single application company, and they were years behind. I think they were using TeamSite for their website. But they went through a real strategic multi-year process, in terms of how are we going to organize the marketing function? What are the types of capabilities that we need? What is the 3-year roadmap of when we implement these types of, and that allowed them to make a massive leapfrog against companies that they were previously behind. Because if this foundation is set, if you have the proper governance in place, if you have the right roles and responsibilities and skill sets, they have something called a MarTech enablement team. Isn't that sort of what we're supposed to be doing here?
I was going to say, shouldn't everyone have one? Or
shouldn't everyone have them? And also,
or be part of an existing team, yeah.
That's right. And my role is simply to train as many of these individuals. I have targets for that. Yes. Change management is another huge barrier, and we had another Australian superannuation firm present with me in Summit, AMP. It's a public presentation. Yeah. They had a dedicated change manager. Change management, let's have a dedicated role that facilitates that. Yeah. But back to the point is, we this is an industry that if you take the right initial steps, you will be able to run much faster and much further with that foundation.
Are you seeing more of these centers of excellence in marketing come through in different organizations?
Absolutely. I think, the migration path is, let's call it for personalization, like marketing might be responsible for it. Okay. Then you start seeing centralized capabilities, an analytics team, an optimization team, a data management team. And then there's a recognition that these teams have to, basically interoperate to become these centers of excellence. But for our most sophisticated customers, there's a recognition. And by the way, that's a big step to get to the COE phase. But then there's this phase where the COE is never going to overtake the size of the company. It's never going to be as big as other departments. It's a finite size, and ultimately it reaches its capacity if this COE executes on behalf of the entire enterprise. So ultimately, this COE has to move from I do everything to I then scale, provision, and govern. And that is also like a very tough migration. These are individuals like, I'm used to setting up every test. You don't need to. You just have to create standards and best practices and scale it. And then on the other side of that, you have individuals within these business units that are desperate to use these tools independently, have very clear swim lanes of where they operate that don't intersect with others that should be using these capabilities independently. So there's this whole push and pull between, how do I enable these users? How do I scale the correct use of these applications? But that's just, again, a maturity element. Bringing it all the way back to AI, isn't this where this happens? Mm-hmm. So the skill sets become easier to train. The brand guidelines, the governance and use of data is set, and a lot of the capabilities that we have that we're talking about, Gen Studio for performance marketing, or even things like Adobe Express, that's the end game. Scaling that to the people that want to rapidly experiment with email or social, or the person in a local branch that wants to just produce an 8.5 by 11 poster for something local that they can't do normally.
It just sounds like the normal, if you like, a mirror of the growth of a professional. You grow from doing the work, managing the work, to then leading the work, right?
That's a great analogy.
Right?
That's a great analogy, yeah.
And also be friends with the change management person.
You gotta be friends with the change, as we all know.
And HR.
Definitely. Who do you not have? And the CFO.
Okay.
Right.
So everyone, there we go.
You gotta be friends with everybody, basically.
Okay. Chris Young, thanks for your time.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
I want to pick up on one thing at the end here as we think about attention to detail. And it's something that we talked about with Chris, because when it comes to customers, we need to really understand how they're going day to day, moment to moment, and transaction to transaction. Right? What's actually going on? How can I support this experience? If you're in the banking sector, this question of value comes to the fore, and you need to be owning that in the marketing team. You've got to be having a team around you that understands this mission, and as Chris was saying, to reflect that back into the organization. How are they thinking and feeling? How are they responding? And how can we sustainably stay connected to this idea of attention to detail? So take that as a great bit of wisdom and advice, and I hope you go well. That's it for this episode of the CMO Show. Thanks for joining us. Until next time. The CMO Show is produced by Impact Institute in partnership with Adobe. Impact Institute is a professional services firm for purpose-led organisations. Our unique blend of impact consulting, brand storytelling and event services help our clients create meaningful change. This episode of the CMO Show was brought to you by your host, Mark Jones, that's me, and producers Kate Zadell and Kirsten Babels. Our audio engineers are Ed Chang and Daniel Mahon. And a quick shout out to Adobe Experience Cloud, which gives digital businesses everything they need to design and deliver great customer experiences. Visit business.adobe.com to learn how Adobe can help transform your business.